Here we go. Welcome, everybody. United Way has been a proud partner of Pathfinders since 1974. That's older than me, if you were wondering. So we have been supporting young people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, especially LGBTQ plus young people who are disproportionately at risk. And that is a priority of United Ways. We invest in 6 programs at Pathfinders within health and financial stability, and also within our Safe and Stable Homes Initiative, which is our effort to end family homelessness across our 4-county region. We support clinical services at the Drop, community case management, Pathfinders Youth Shelter, preventing family homelessness for young adults through Safe and Stable Homes, and prevention education programming, and supportive housing. So across a lot of different areas that Pathfinder supports. So I am just here to say welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Pleased to introduce Tim Baack, Darla, President and CEO of Pathfinders. Tim, if you could. Yeah. Darla Bardine, Executive Director of the National Network for Youth, and Renee Kernberger, the Senior Vice President of Development and Communication at Pathfinders. And I'll let you all take that away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you to United Way. Amazing partners all day, every day, all year long. We're really grateful for this opportunity to use this space to convene and discuss such an important topic affecting our community, especially during what is Milwaukee's Homeless Awareness Week, during LGBTQ plus History Month, and with last week's National Coming Out Day. So we think this is a particularly poignant topic to discuss. And thank you all for coming and joining us today and spending some time with us to learn more about these issues, whether you're here to learn, to support the LGBTQ plus community, or because you identify as a member of that community, or all of the above. We're grateful to share this time together. So earlier this year, our partners at the National Network for Youth released an LGBTQ youth homelessness policy brief, which is in front of you. It was clear, direct, and insightful, and much of it aligned with our experiences here, both at Pathfinders and in Milwaukee. So that's sort of how this conversation today came together. That copy you can also find with our issue brief that is hot off the press that we're just releasing right now. You're the first people to see it. Hopefully we will have some broader media coverage to share this information wider, and we'll be sharing more broadly with our donors and supporters next month during Youth Homelessness Awareness Month, which is in November. I'm going to dive right in, and we're going to do sort of a compare and contrast conversation with Tim and Darla. But first, I would love for them to share a little bit, just again, introduce themselves and share a little bit about their organizations to level set, because some of you may be more familiar and you may be less familiar. So, would you two start, please?
Go ahead.
Apologies, I have a cough drop as I'm recovering from pneumonia. So hopefully you all can hear me. But my name's Darla Bardine. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of the National Network for Youth. I'm usually based in DC. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this important conversation. We've been proud partners of Pathfinders for many decades, before I was born, similar remarks over there. I was definitely born after 1974. I won't say how many years. So a little bit about the National Network for Youth. We are a network of over 300 community-based youth homelessness service providers across the country. And we partner with young people with lived experience of homelessness as well. And together with young people and providers like Pathfinders, we seek to transform systems through federal policy change. We also work in communities and provide technical support and assistance to help communities accelerate their progress in preventing and ending youth homelessness by centering the voices and expertise of youth with lived experience and bringing together all the system partners within a community. So that's a little bit about us, and I'm happy to be here.
Great, thank you, Darla. All right, full disclosure, I didn't know we were going to be talking about our ages, but I am older than that. But I'm not so old that I was not at Pathfinders when United Way first began its funding. In fact, I learned that today for the first time, that that's how long United Way has been a supporter and funder of ours. So we appreciate that support. We appreciate them opening up their space for this important conversation. Similarly, we appreciate all the work that Darla and her team at the National Network for Youth does at a federal level to really advocate for strong policy and good, solid practice. Pathfinders has been in this community since 1970. And our focus is on empowering youth and changing lives. That's our mission for those youth and young adults aged 25 and under who are experiencing varying levels of homelessness, housing instability, and trauma that is often associated with those experiences. We reach thousands of young people each year, and of those, we provide intensive individualized services for well over 800 young people and their families each year. We're probably best known for our work in the runaway and homeless youth area. But over the years, based on what young people themselves have told us, we have grown and expanded to continue to try to meet the needs of those young people. You're going to hear us talk a lot about disproportionality because that really is at the heart of who we serve and what we see in our work at Pathfinders. And it's not a good thing by any means, but I think it's an important element for you to deepen your own understanding of how it is that so many of the young people that we serve who identify as LGBTQ+ are disproportionately impacted by the issues surrounding homelessness and housing instability and the vulnerability that that creates for them. So you'll be hearing more about that as we get into some of the content. As Renee mentioned, both the policy brief that the National Network produced earlier this spring, as well as our own, also gives you more detailed information that I hope you will take a look at and take with you, and hopefully will galvanize your willingness to act on behalf of the young people that we serve here in our community and across the country.
Wonderful, thank you both. Darla, first, what do you estimate the unhoused youth population to be when we're looking at that 18 to 25-year-old segment? And in your brief, you referenced that 40% of youth experiencing homelessness in the US identify as LGBTQ, and they're also disproportionately youth of color. What makes both of those numbers so high?
All right, lots of data and numbers coming at you all. I hope you're prepared. So the most recent national research and data on the prevalence of youth homelessness in the United States is from 2017, and it's the Voices of Youth count that was conducted by Chapin Hall. And they found that 1 in 10 18 to 25-year-olds across the United States experienced some form of homelessness within a 12-month period. So that equated to, like, I think 3.5 million 18 to 25-year-olds in the United States. The 1 in 10 is just helpful to get to the prevalence and the percentage. And of that research, and I want to emphasize, because I often think this issue is talked about in more urban centers, just the prevalence of homelessness in general. The other key thing that Chapin Hall research found is that the prevalent rate of homelessness was statistically the same. I'm not a researcher. I hope some of you know what that means. Between rural communities, urban, suburban. I guess there's 4 different types of urbanicity. So it's not just an urban issue. It's just the numbers are higher because the population is higher. And of that, up to 40% of youth experiencing homelessness in the United States do identify as LGBTQ2S+. And what we know, and the LGBTQ youth are also disproportionately youth of color. And what we know is that historical and present systemic racism and discrimination are some key drivers, as well as, generational poverty and systems involvement in the juvenile and the criminal justice system. And we know for LGBTQ youth in particular, they experience family rejection. So family reject a young person because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity, and they're either kicked out or they're fleeing the abuse, physical, mental, verbal, that they're experiencing from their family because of their sexual orientation and gender identity.
Thank you. Tim, will you give us a sense of the extent of unhoused young adults in Milwaukee and about how many LGBTQ youth we see at Pathfinders that are seeking services?
I mean, numbers are important for a variety of reasons, and as Darla was mentioning, it is important to try to get a handle on what is the extent of the problem facing our young people in general, and for the purposes of our conversation today, LGBTQ plus identified young people in particular, which again are also disproportionately represented as youth of color or within the BIPOC communities. Using the data from Chapin Hall that Darla just mentioned, the 1 in 10 young adults, 1 in 30 adolescents, and then you look at our own census data, that leads us to believe that there are roughly about 12,000 young people who experience some form of homelessness and housing instability annually. Now that's a number that is an extrapolation, and we have to extrapolate because some of the surveys and the other ways that that is attempted to be measured or count is always insufficient or incomplete. For example, every year HUD, as one of the major funders federally in terms of homeless resources and support, they require communities to do a point-in-time survey, and that's done the last Wednesday of January of every year. That is a street count. That is a count of those individuals that, according to HUD, are in what's called Category 1, literally homeless. Those are people living on the streets, in cars, in places not meant for human habitation. That's only one of 4 categories that is recognized as how homelessness can be identified. And that I bring up because it's so important when we're talking about youth and young adult, the number of what we sometimes refer to as the hidden homeless. Those are individuals who don't fit the criteria that HUD has established for Category 1, but nonetheless still have high rates of housing instability and vulnerability associated with that. The other thing about young people and homelessness in general, and this is certainly true for LGBTQ plus identified young people in particular, but their homelessness changes over time. They can go from being on the streets to staying with a friend, to being back, maybe in a shelter, then maybe being in a place where they're being trafficked or exploited sexually in order to have their housing needs met. And they will go through those cycles of homelessness. And so a point in time is just that. It's a singular moment of what were you, where were you at that moment when somebody found you and surveyed you. So it's only a snapshot and it's an incomplete picture at best. Another data point that I think is important is one that is from another source that looks at another federal definition, which is a much more inclusive definition of homelessness, and that's data that comes from the Milwaukee Public School System and their homeless education program. In the last year alone, we have seen through their data and their surveying an 18% increase in the number of children and young people who are identified as homeless or highly housing unstable. And we are now approaching in the current school year nearly 5,000 young people that system alone has identified as experiencing either homelessness or housing instability. That's a significant number. What we see at Pathfinders is certainly a reflection of that. Darla talked about disproportionality. We've mentioned that. How young people who identify as queer, the proportion that they represent for our overall youth sometimes varies from program to program. But I will say in our supported housing programs, we are well over 50% of young people who identify on that spectrum of queer identity. And we also recognize that identity is fluid. And so we really allow young people to self-identify in ways that work for them. And I just want to repeat that number, more than 50%. Typically identify somewhere on that identity spectrum who are being served currently in our supported housing. But regardless of our programmatic area, we generally see disproportionately high numbers of queer identified young people in need of our services and support. And that has historically always been true for us as a LGBTQ plus inclusive organization.
Wonderful. Okay, so I want to go a little further into policy, which these two love, but I have promised that I will cut off their mics if they go too far, because they love policy. And it's a really dense topic, right? So can we talk a little bit about how does the lack of a single federal definition of homelessness influence both the prevalence of homelessness that's counted and how much federal funding is available at the local community level?
Okay. How you define a problem will determine often the amount of effort and resources that are put into solving that problem. And the eligibility for those services and resources is often determined by how you define who's eligible. So definitions really matter. And one of the efforts that we are in strong collaboration with the National Network for Youth on is passage of the Homeless Children and Youth Act. It is a piece of legislation at the federal level that has been introduced many times, hasn't made it across the finish line, but with every passing year, I think has greater urgency in getting it passed. What it essentially does is it levels the playing field at the federal level for the definition of who is considered homeless. Because the definition in large part then determines and then who is eligible for that particular stream of funding support. Most of the work that we do at Pathfinders has historically been funded either by the Department of Education or the Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level. They are the originator at the Health and Human Services of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, now referred to as the Runaway and Homeless Youth and Trafficking Prevention Act.
You got it.
Wow, I always did that wrong. That's a really important piece of legislation because it both establishes policy standards and best practices for those of us who are receiving those federal dollars and provide those services at the local level. And just real briefly, we do all three of the eligible categories through that federal funding. So our youth shelter is funded, transitional living program as part of our supported housing, and our really important street outreach program, which just got refunded for another 3 years. Those are all core funding sources that really are the foundation of much of the work that we do. Their definition of an eligible youth who is homeless or experiencing housing instability is very comparable to that used by the Department of Education. It is very distinct from how HUD defines who is eligible. Now, you're going to hear me talk a lot about, the issues that we have with HUD. I will say, to their credit, they have also recognized that they need to focus efforts and resources on homeless young people in ways they've never done before. And so the Youth Homeless Demonstration Project grant is something that we are the recipients of as a community for the very first time, something we learned just a couple of weeks ago. That's a big deal. We are now the third continuum of care in the states for COCs to receive that funding, and we got it on our very first effort and first application. So our partnership with fellow RHY providers, the City of Milwaukee, who serves as the lead agency in our continuum of care, that's going to be a game changer, but it's not in and of itself going to be enough to change the trajectory of what we're seeing relative to the high numbers of homeless young people that we're serving, again, in general. And there's always concern at the federal level, and unfortunately, as we'll talk about in a little while, here in the state level as well, relative to whether queer identified young people are considered to be worthy of that support. And that shouldn't even be a question, but it's a question that's constantly posed at both the federal and the state level. Fortunately for us, not so much at the local level. But we'll get into more of that in a little while.
Yeah, so just building off, there is not one federal definition of homelessness. There are multiple. How are we ever going to truly prevent and end homelessness in this country if you have multiple federal agencies that can't even agree on what homelessness is? And the reality is that how children, youth, and families experience homelessness is often much more hidden and fluid than the chronically homeless adult population. And part of what hasn't been shared yet, I mean, young people and families are trying to stay hidden because they don't want the child welfare system to take away custody of their children. A lot of young people that we partner with, they don't want to enter the child welfare system. You know, to them, it's a harmful system. It's not about youth choice and voice. It's whatever the system tells you is best for you, you do. It's not youth-led in any way, in sharp contrast to programs like Pathfinders that are voluntary. Youth are raising their hand and they're saying, I want this program to help me, because the program works very hard to create and provide the type of housing and services that young people want and need. So it's a very different orientation to helping youth and families. So I'll give you numbers, because I work the federal appropriations process, which is currently a total mess in DC. But when you look at the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services gets about $150 million a year. The McKinney-Vento Education Program gets about the same, $150 million. HUD, Homelessness Assistance, with the most narrow definition, focusing most of their resources on chronically homeless single adults, gets $3 billion a year, okay? So, and then we have data and research that shows that 40% or more of chronically homeless single adults were first homeless under the age of 25. So we have $3 billion of federal dollars saying, we're gonna make you get sick, and then you're gonna be a priority, then you're gonna be eligible. We say this is bad policy. This is not implementing a public health or a human right framework to how we are approaching addressing homelessness in this country. And not only is that HUD policy, they have created this policy and they've developed outcomes that they pat themselves on the back that they're doing a good job, right? So this is why I'm in DC advocating with our partners for the Homeless Children and Youth Act, and the point in time count that Tim talked about. It's in the middle of the night in January for a reason. They're trying to keep the numbers low, and they're only finding adults. So the numbers that Congress is getting from the federal agency responsible for housing and homelessness in the United States, they're getting low numbers and mainly adults. So when you think of the urgency and the visibility on children, youth, and families in general, let alone queer youth who are, you know, discriminated against and have so many other barriers that they have to overcome. I mean, it's just a huge systemic issue. And then when it comes to working together locally, the federal government's like, oh, you all need to work together. We don't even have the same definition. We don't even have the same eligibility. So I'm, you know, say I'm a McKinney-Vento liaison, I've identified a student as homeless. I call the HUD continuum of care, oh, well, they're not homeless for us, so they're not eligible for anything. It's like, how can we expect all folks to work together at the local level to solve a complex social crisis if we're not even on the same page? Did I cover it all? I'm very passionate and I adore policy, so in case you can't tell.
Go ahead.
Well,
That's hard to top.
I was going to say thank you for your passionate advocacy, Darla, which is one of the things we love about you, but I feel like Tim would like to add a little more if I know him well before I move on.
Sure. I think, Darla, that is so well said. And it's an ongoing challenge for us as a local community, but nationwide. Again, it's hard to understand what to invest in a problem when you don't know that the problem exists in the first place. And often people, understandably, will want to know the extent of the problem. How do you quantify it? So, policy is driven by numbers, and numbers are important. But how you get at the numbers is also a policy question. And so we are certainly in agreement and in full support of the national network's efforts at the federal level to really look at leveling the playing field. We can't have this problem of homelessness amongst our young people continue to be an invisible or a hidden problem. And the way that young people experience homelessness and housing instability is developmentally their experience, and that is different than adults. Although I will say, the data also supports that so many of adults who are experiencing or continuing to experience homelessness or housing instability had that first episode when they were young people. So when we talk about the demographic that we serve at Pathfinders and our colleagues across the state and across the country who do this work, when we talk about this is the best opportunity we as communities have for really breaking that cycle, that intergenerational aspect of homelessness, that's what we mean. This is an opportunity that needs more resources invested so that we can ensure that that lifetime experience of homelessness is not what our young people continue to have as part of their future. And we say that for all young people. You know, there are particular pressures and challenges that our queer young people unfortunately also have to experience and deal with. And that's something that as a community we also need to do better by them.
So this is one of those points where this is where you all come in, right? This is where, whether you're here with us today or you're watching this later, in the brief that we provided you, there are recommendations, and some of those recommendations are to educate yourself on these issues, on these acts that we are talking about today. It's on page 5. You can visit the National Network for Youth's website because that is what they do. They are experts in this legislative space. You can scan the QR code to get there. You can use, you can Google these words on their website. All of these ways you can sort of get engaged and advocate for changes, whether it's federal definition or more funding. We hope that that's something you choose to do with us and in support of all of these communities of unhoused young people. So moving on to another topic, let's talk a little bit about commonalities. Are there commonalities in the unhoused experience for queer young people at the local and national level? For example, here we know that youth homelessness is pretty invisible, as you just talked about, Tim. And we hear from young people at Pathfinders how uncomfortable they are accessing shelter services for a variety of reasons. Can you both talk a little bit more about this?
All right, we'll start more locally and then we'll expand the view a little bit. As I mentioned, Pathfinders has been in this community since 1970, and early on in our history, I think we were one of the first organizations to recognize both the unmet need that existed amongst young people seeking runaway and homeless youth services, and in particular, how many of those young people were either struggling with their own identity or had already identified somewhere on that spectrum of either gender or orientation, in that sphere of queerness. And I think we as an organization have really both done our own internal work, but also as a community advocated for inclusive and competent strategies and practices so that young people, regardless of who they identified as, felt safe and included. And I don't think I could probably overstate how difficult it is for our queer young people to ask for help at a time where they may have been kicked out of their home, and newsflash, that still happens a lot. Or have faced other types of bullying or rejection or traumatization or victimization or trafficking or exploitation. I mean, the list goes on and on. To be absolutely to the point, though, of the spectrum of young people within the queer community that we serve, those who are most marginalized and at sometimes the greatest disadvantage through no fault of their own are those who identify as transgendered. And I think, we have a lot of work yet to do to make sure that emergency housing that is provided via temporary shelter, as well as longer-term transitional or permanent housing, that is reflective of safe space for people who identify as non-binary, people who identify in ways that don't necessarily fit the boxes that sometimes we try to put people in. We're talking about people's comfort as well as their safety. And we haven't always done the job we need to do by our young people. That's something I think all of us can do better at. And sometimes we don't get a lot of support from those who fund us because, again, they like to have us check boxes. And there's a lot of boxes we have to check sometimes just to continue to be eligible for funding. The reality is increasingly young people are pushing back against the boxes that they're offered. And we applaud that. And we also know that, again, data and information matters. And so we really try to walk that line in terms of helping both young people understand what's available to them, but also helping the community understand what the continued unmet need is locally.
So from the national perspective, we know that queer youth, and queer youth of color in particular, when compared to white cisgender youth experiencing homelessness, face much higher rates of violence while experiencing homelessness and victimization. They also face much higher rates of trauma and mental health challenges, as well as much higher rates of suicide and homicide while experiencing homelessness. So for us, this is why everything Tim said is so critical and important. And we know not every community has safe, welcoming, and affirming and celebratory spaces that, you know, celebrate a young person's sexual orientation or gender identity and provide housing options even in line with the gender that they identify, federal law aside, right? So for us, it's just so important to remove those barriers, not to just the definition of homelessness, but barriers of transphobia and other forms of discrimination. And young people experiencing homelessness in general, and queer and youth of color in particular, are not easy to trust other adults or systems or programs because they've been failed by systems, whether it's the child welfare system exited them to homelessness, or they got caught up with law enforcement and the juvenile justice system because of being homeless, or, you know, family conflict, trauma, rejection, any number of reasons. And these are developmental years. And so it's not easy for young people to trust that anybody actually cares about them or has their best interest in mind. But what gives me hope, so not to be all doom and gloom, is what we hear consistently from young people. What made the difference for them was being accepted without any caveats, and for who they are, and supported. And it took like just one person that they felt genuinely cared, that wasn't just helping them for a paycheck, but someone that genuinely cared about them as a human, with no exception. That's what made the difference for them and their life trajectory.
You know, I would just add, we can't talk about this issue without using the word stigma, because our young people have stigma at multiple levels. There is the stigma that continues to surround homelessness. There is the stigma that continues to surface anytime we talk about mental wellness or the need for mental health or mental wellness support, and clearly the stigma that continues to surround queer identity. And so you add all those various ways that our young people are experiencing and burdened by stigma, and I think we should have a better understanding of why it is sometimes an act of courage for our queer young people to ask us as adults, whether as adults we identify as queer or not, to ask us for support and to ask us for help at a time where they are probably at their most vulnerable. So I think we have to really be honoring of the fact that stigma still exists in all of those spheres and then some. And those are the things that we have put on our young people that frankly we should be ashamed we continue to do.
Thank you. This is sort of the last little segment with just Tim and Darla. We're going to bring in a few more voices, but I want to talk about laws for a second. So in just the first 3 months of this year, 417 anti-LGBTQ plus laws were introduced in state legislatures across the U.S., the majority of which were focused on education and health-related and healthcare. And to date, in 2023, 574 anti-trans bills alone have been introduced in 49 states. Darla, why are we seeing such a huge increase, and how does this targeting affect the issue of homelessness.
Yeah, it's so sad to hear those numbers out loud. So, we're seeing this, I think, for two primary reasons, I would say. One is at the federal level, we failed to pass comprehensive non-discrimination protections for the LGBTQ queer community. That would be the Equality Act. It has not had enough votes to make it across the finish line. So we do continue to endorse that legislation at the National Network for Youth. There just isn't the political will. So in the absence of the very needed federal protections, like basic human rights, federal protections from discrimination, you're seeing all these bills being introduced, and it is very much a Republican Party strategy for the 2024 election cycle. So it is very much the Republican Party drumming up support from their base, because they're hoping to take over the White House, Congress, as many state legislators and governors. So it's very much like a concerted effort. And it's feeding into, unfortunately, widespread anti-trans sentiment, I would say more so even than other queer identities. The anti-transness we're seeing in not just bills being introduced, but actually some laws are passing in states, which is even more alarming because it is taking away any type of medical or health protection and even taking away rights of youth in school systems. So I would say that's why we're seeing it. The impact for youth experiencing homelessness is any queer youth experiencing homelessness who's living in these states where these bills have been passed have had their rights eroded. They're no longer able to access affirming medical care in some states. Their privacy rights, education rights, that has been eroded. But we've also, it's been reported, there's been an increase, how to say this, LGBTQ youth, given all the anti-queer laws that have been introduced, has impacted their mental health, and suicide rates have increased. So just having all these anti-queer bills introduced is having a negative effect on the mental health of queer identifying youth, including youth experiencing homelessness.
I wish, at the local or state level, I could say something that would be contrary to what Darla just said is happening at the federal level. But in fact, what we're seeing is mirroring at the state level what is happening federally. And I'm just going to share a little bit of commentary, not coming from me, but coming from some of our elected officials in Madison who are members of the Wisconsin Legislative LGBTQ+ caucus. I hope all of you are aware that 3 bills were introduced in early October, just a couple of weeks ago. They were Assembly Bill 377, Assembly Bill 378, and Assembly Bill 465. All 3 passed the Assembly. Comparable bills passed the Senate. And if you've been paying attention, I hope what I'm about to say you know, both the Assembly and the Senate are heavily Republican controlled. The saving grace, and there is yet another bill that has just been introduced this week, and I don't even know what the number is because, well, whatever. And it's equally as harmful. And the saving grace in all of this has been that although the Assembly and the Senate passed those bills, the governor has vetoed them, and they don't have a sufficient number in the legislature to override the veto. But let me quote what the LGBTQ+ caucus had to say about that. Although these bills will not become law in our state, their reintroduction alone is harmful and dangerous. We call on our Republican colleagues to stop giving these bills an official platform and to not take any further action on them. We stand with transgender and non-binary youth in Wisconsin. To the transgender and non-binary people of our state, you are seen, you are loved, and you belong here. And I hope we can all take that to heart because, as Darla just, I think, so appropriately noted, sometimes it's not even about whether the bill becomes law. It's the introduction of the bill alone that creates hate and violence and damage to the quality of life for our young people. And so that's just something that is really increasingly tragic, both in our state and nationally, because as we know, and as Darla noted, it's politically driven. It's about power, and it's about reclaiming seats of power, and it's partisan.
Thank you. Tim and Darla are going to stay up here with us, but now we are going to bring a few more folks to this panel to share some more voices and some more perspectives, which we're very excited about. First, DeShanda Clark, our Senior Vice President of Programs and Services at Pathfinders. Davonta, a Pathfinders AmeriCorps staff member and Youth Action Board member at Pathfinders. And Justin Roby, he's on staff at Diverse and Resilient, and he's also representing United Way's Pride United Network as its co-chair. So thank you to the three of you for joining us. So I'm going to do a mix of some questions that I still have, along with questions that we asked for your input over the past couple of days, and we have some really great questions from you. We might have some time at the end. I'm mindful of the time. I thank you for your time again and your patience. I know we're throwing a lot of serious, dense work here at you all, but we know this is something that everyone in this room is incredibly passionate about, and this is work that matters deeply. So the first thing, DeShanda, I'd love for you to talk, and we have to share microphones. So we're in the sharing of the microphone phase. This is always fun, but we will play nicely in the sandbox. DeShanda, will you discuss a little bit about why and how Pathfinders is an LGBTQ plus inclusive versus exclusive organization?
Well, I'll start with the how. I feel like my experience, so I've been with Pathfinders for a total of 10 years, and coming in, I was within the age range of the youth that we serve. I was about 22 when I started, and I learned in that time that we're a safe space for young people in Milwaukee that are truly just trying to access their basic and immediate needs, their basic human rights, which is just having a safe space to be, being able to connect with trusting adults, and just being able to take care of their hygiene and eat food and some of the luxuries that a lot of us may take advantage of today. Those young people were coming into a space where there were many other people who felt safe gathering. On any given day, we would see up to about 30 young people accessing the drop-in center. And I remember, which is where my beginning started, I was in UWM undergraduate intern. And I remember in my training on intakes, the coordinator at the time said, there's so many different young people here from so many different backgrounds and intersecting identities, and they all talk to each other, they all get along, they all respect each other. And I had learned that young people, and it helped me too with my own self and my own identity, with feeling safe enough to identify on the spectrum of identity on any given day, like regardless of the box they check or not check, and young people don't like checking boxes. That's an adult thing, I guess. Young people are like, this is who I am today, this is what I want to have on, and this is the name that I go by, and these are my pronouns. And there are young people that don't want to talk about or say any of that, but they still fit within that spectrum. And because they're coming in to access those basic human rights that they should have, it is more so about them as a person and their needs and that feeling of care. And so they don't feel like they can't access services because they don't identify a certain type of way. They still feel pretty open to be expressive and really be who they are. be who they are. And because we serve youth as young as 11, they also get that freedom of expression to really understand, like, who am I as a young child? I remember one of my favorite services we offer is our clothing bank. And going back there with young people who really appreciate the varying clothes that we have to offer, and they would go to one side or the other because at home or with grandma, if they are male identified in that space, they can't put on a dress and they can't paint their nails, and you know, there's certain things that they can't wear, but in our space, they were able to explore that and feel safe being who they are and getting that type of support. And so it just allowed for young people to be more expressive and come more into who they are, which is something that I wish I had as a young child. And so it really opens them up to that trust and that safety.
Thank you. Tim, how does it make Pathfinders stronger being an inclusive versus exclusive organization?
In a couple of, I think, really important ways, and I'll just start by saying, you know, representation matters. And like DeShanda, I started at Pathfinders as a graduate student intern quite a few years before she did. But unlike DeShanda, I was not an openly queer man when I got hired at the organization. My coming out was part of my professional journey as much as it was my personal journey. And in that time, I have seen us as an organization really work very hard to embody that phrase, representation matters. And so I think there is always room to do better. But I think we've done really well at increasing the representation across our team, both paid and unpaid, to be more representative of the young people we serve. You know, I think there is space in our community for both inclusive as well as exclusive LGBTQ plus identified organizations. I think our particular strength is that we're an inclusive organization where it doesn't matter if you identify it with one of those letters in that LGBTQ plus identifier. You can be whoever you are, and whoever you are can continue to evolve and grow and change because we're an inclusive organization that will welcome and embrace and love you regardless of that evolving identity. And I know for some young people that feels safer than having to go to an exclusive LGBTQ plus identified organization. But again, I think there is room and there is need in our community for both. I just think there's some added value to the work we do at Pathfinders because of our open embrace of all young people.
Something I was thinking about, things like this. Something I was thinking about too was because we are open as a safe space in that way, and if folks don't identify, we still learn like some of the things that they feel a little bit more honest about their experiences in the community when they're dealing with homelessness and some of the things that they have to do to get their needs met. And so they can trust us enough because we're so open and supportive of them. So we can truly meet health needs. We can truly meet some of their basic needs without more harmful implications to their health, their mental health, their physical health, and just their spirit and morale in general, and making sure that we're reducing the harm that they would be experiencing otherwise because they don't have that trust and that freedom of expression to be who they are, but instead feel more shameful if you have to exchange sex for your basic needs, or there's certain things that you have to do just to get by from day to day. And so it feels like we're really also supporting them with like just making sure that their health doesn't deteriorate more, or there's not more harm being caused because they can't be who they are, or just really express the honest to God truth things that they're going through from day to day.
Great, thank you. Davonta, you're up. Tell us a little bit, why are mental health supports so important for both queer and not queer young people, especially at Pathfinders?
I feel like mental health is important. Why? Because like LGBT people, they go through a lot. Like me, I've grown up being bullied and stuff because of who I am. So it's like you gotta kind of keep yourself together. For me, it's like finding one support person that I can talk to on a daily basis. And Pathfinders was like that type of place for me. I'm able to be free, be who I am without anyone judging me. like that's really what it's about, to having that support that you need as far as having the mental issues and like stabilities and stuff like that. For non-LGBT based, I feel like it's still the same situation. People go through their life things and don't have no one to talk to at that given time. So like, yeah, Pathfinders is like a multicultural type of place for me. I mean, it makes me happy.
Well, it makes us happy to have you there. Justin, will you talk a little bit about Diverse and Resilient? Share a little bit about what that organization is and sort of what you do and what you're seeing with regard to some of these issues that we're talking about today with queer young people.
Absolutely. DNR is what we call Diverse and Resilient. We are a LGBTQ health, equity, and safety organization. So we work every day to advocate for the increased safety and increased lived experience of people who identify as LGBTQ around the state of Wisconsin. We have an office here in Milwaukee and in Appleton. We have recently gone into and increased our harm reduction material and being able to fully be able to service our community. So we have partnered with the Milwaukee County Behavioral Health Division to offer a harm reduction vending machine. So we provide fentanyl testing strips, Narcan, medication deactivation pouches, medication lock bags, and gun locks to help give our community barrier-free access to harm reduction methodologies. We have prided ourselves over nearly 30 years of experience with sexual and reproductive health. So that is our primary focus. We are providing that education, that testing, treatment, and care navigation for people who are affected by HIV or any STIs. I'm so really proud to be able to do that work and provide that education both to young adults and adults alike. We don't discriminate in the way that we provide those experiences. But what we have come to learn is that for LGBTQ people who are who have had access to sexual and reproductive health education, it wasn't as holistic. It was needed. So there's that additional learning. But then we also talk about the increased risk, especially LGBTQ houseless individuals have, and that intersection of being vulnerable for all of those. So how can we empower our community to make those optimal health decisions, like engaging with PrEP or PEP, which are great and very efficacious modalities of preventing HIV, but also being engaged in treatment and having those holistic conversations with their partners. So how do we do that? How do we provide that? And then another thing I would love to uplift that we do well as an organization is capacity building. So for organizations who are looking to increase their capacity with serving LGBTQ people, we provide LGBT 101, just the basic facts of LGBTQ, how to be a strong, and what I've now been saying is a louder or prouder ally than you have ever been, because that's what we need now with these unprecedented attacks against the LGBTQ community. So again, we love to provide that education, that growth, and that stigma-free space for organizations to increase their capacity to serve our community as well. So we see the need, we continue to advocate and try to move the needle, but it's through great partnerships like this. I know we often spend time down at Pathfinders providing our services to your youth. So we engage in any ways that we can find an upstream solution to the problems that we're facing within our community.
DNR is absolutely a critical partner, and we all have lots and lots of partners. I know DNR partners with hundreds of organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, and so do we at Pathfinders. And DNR is just a critically important voice and resource in our community. So a follow-up for Tim and Justin, what are some of the challenges in providing more of these services that we're talking about, whether mental health, public health, in Greater Milwaukee, in our community?
Well, I really enjoyed the way that you talked about the different ways federal agencies define our issues. So of course that creates the biggest challenge. And I think the breadth of issues that we face in Milwaukee sometimes can be overwhelming to conceptualize for our funders and hard for them to really truly conceptualize the lived experiences of people in poverty. Oftentimes funders are curious, like they know that they're aware that they are removed from the lived experiences of the people that we serve, but they also don't fully get the nuances that we uplift as an organization. So sometimes it's being creative, it's finding new partnerships to fill the gaps that we see with our current funding sources. It can also be a matter of innovation. So sometimes it's collaboration over going over something new, but those collaboration takes time. It takes intentionality. It takes, how do we continue to fill the gaps by moving as strategically as possible to address what we see as holes or gaps in our net of care, is what I like to always say. We try to provide as a community. So again, finding those strategic partners and dealing with what I think is a issue in most organization turnover, right? Being able to know who is who and where and how do I connect and how do we share resources in a way that inevitably benefits our community. So I think we as institutions have to work on that, but then also recognizing how complex the issues are that we're working with. They do need innovative solutions, but the complexity is not lost to the people doing the work.
Everything you said. Last week was the annual National Coming Out Day recognition, October 11th of each year. That's at this point, a fairly long-standing day of recognition. And for those of you maybe not as familiar with it, its intent is to support, encourage, and embrace people who identify as queer, again, wherever they are on that spectrum, to come out. And what that means is to be visible, to let others know who you are, and to do that with pride. And the whole theory behind that is by increasing visibility, you are increasing people's awareness and opportunity for greater understanding and compassion. We talked about this earlier. Visibility, whether it's about queer identity, whether it's about the issue of homelessness, whether it's about the growing mental wellness crisis that is affecting so many young people, visibility is the starting point. And absent that, it's really hard to galvanize the collective will, the political will, the community will to do something about it. So if you don't know that somebody exists, you're going to be less inclined to be understanding and compassionate and supportive. If you don't know that a problem exists, you're going to be less likely to want to or feel the need to invest the resources and the effort to solve that problem. So I think a lot of that is all about visibility. With awareness comes the opportunity for understanding. I think what gets in the way of that is sometimes implicit and oftentimes explicit efforts to keep these issues, to keep these people invisible. Whether that's through threats or acts of violence or intimidation, through laws and legislation that is presented and attempted to be passed. Those are intentional ways of making issues remain hidden, remain invisible.
Staying on the topic of visibility, Darla, how does data collection that includes sexual orientation and gender identity through vehicles like the National Census affect laws and government funding?
Probably less than they should. I think, from our perspective, we really think federal agencies and federal programs need to do a better job coordinating and start collecting similar data across programs. And one of our recommendations, and it is something I think the administration has been working on, is really ensuring that all programs are collecting data around gender identity and sexual orientation, as well as race, identity, and ethnicity, because it's really important to track outcomes. And are these programs that we're funding and that we're providing, these housing options, these services, Are they really providing good outcomes for the most historically marginalized and discriminated against young people? So if your program is only producing good outcomes, safe exits, no returns to homelessness for white cis youth, then your program needs to change. And so I think not collecting the data goes to the invisibility and taking, a targeted universalism approach to policy and practice, which I encourage you all to research it later. If we had an hour, I could explain it. But essentially, if the most historically marginalized and discriminated against are achieving good outcomes, then everyone else will too, right? So if the programming is effective for queer youth of color, then it's gonna be effective for straight, cis, white youth, right? So that's why data is so critical, but not just data for the sake of putting out a report, but really to use the data and track outcomes.
Great. Staying on this political, social topic, and one of our audience questions, and we talked about it a little bit, but I don't know that we answered it specifically, so I'm going to ask this question. What is being done politically and socially to counteract the current anti-trans actions and rhetoric? We talked about the fact that it exists, but I don't know that we talked about what is being done to counteract it. Tim and Darla.
Don't want to get too political with you all, but I am from DC after all. I think I talked about it a little bit before. In the absence of, federal protections such as the Equality Act, I think it's limited what the federal government can do around like medical access, which to some extent is a state issue. But there are things that this administration has been doing around LGBTQ protection. So there is HUD equals access rule, which does require that folks provide housing options based on the gender a person identifies. Now, I would say the reporting mechanism when this isn't followed should be improved, but there is a mechanism where if you are a person who is not able to access housing based on your gender identity, you can file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. There is also Fair Housing Act that does prohibit discrimination based on, any number of factors. I would say the challenge we've seen with how the Fair Housing Act is being interpreted in some more conservative communities is concerning. They've been telling providers they can't have any queer identifying words in the title of their programming or organization. That violates fair housing. Some communities have been told they can't even ask about sexual orientation or gender identity, and just asking the data question is a violation of fair housing. None of those are 100% true, and there is going to be some guidance coming around that. So there are some protections in place. I do think how it plays out in practice, there is still a bit of a gray area, and I think it can be very difficult for a person who has been discriminated against to, one, even know that they've been discriminated against, because there is such a long wait list and backlog to even access affordable housing or homelessness. I don't think all queer folks even know that their denial was in any way related to their sexual orientation or gender identity, because there is just such a crisis for resources. What we often hear is that it's case manager to case managers that hear and that actually know it is a violation of the HUD equal access rule, but it has to be the discriminated against individual itself to file the complaint with HUD. So one of the recommendations we've made is that it would be the discriminated against person or someone with firsthand knowledge of a violation of the HUD equal access rule that could file a complaint that would then trigger an investigation. I'm sure I talked more than you wanted me to, but yeah.
Yeah, just in addition to supporting efforts at the federal level that Darla is describing, at Pathfinders, we really embrace the word advocacy. And that's often sort of misunderstood in the nonprofit sector. I've had colleague after colleague say, well, we are not allowed to do that. In fact, that's a core part of what we do in terms of evidence-based best practices in sound, non-discriminatory policy, and then the resources that we and others need to do this important and needed work. And so, that advocacy translates into our work with our partners. We are a member of the Wisconsin Association for Homeless and Runaway Services. They provide leadership at a statewide level for all the member programs that cross the state relative to sound policy and practice. And we are working with them to help try to get across the finish line the Safe Harbor Act, which would prevent young people from being charged with the crime of prostitution, which often surfaces for young people who are being trafficked or exploited sexually. We're also trying to get legislation in place that would increase access for young people self-determining, if they are unaccompanied, their own access to needed medical and mental wellness resources, which right now they are legally prohibited from doing. And then at the local level, we have been a strong voice relative to local legislation that has banned the use of reparative therapy, something that we have not been able to accomplish at the state level. So we have youth in the majority of counties in the state that are still potentially exposed to that discredited and harmful and dangerous practice of trying to convert somebody's gender identity or sexual orientation. And we give voice to any number of issues, whether they're local, at the city, the county, the state, or at the national level, to try to affect meaningful change. So I think advocacy is a really important part that everyone can play. We try to put out messages to our board, to our donors, and to interested parties, encouraging them to take action as well, because the more voices that are joined, the louder that voice is.
Thank you. Davonta and DeShanda, when we're thinking about young people, and when we're talking about young people, we're talking about people age 25 and under, and specifically when we talk about youth homelessness, we're talking about 18 to 25-year-olds. When we talk about this population, and someone experiences an episode of homelessness and goes to seek shelter services, we referenced earlier that sometimes that's not a great fit for this particular age group. Will you share some ways that shelters and homeless service providers can be more culturally competent and more sensitive and inclusive to queer youth?
So, queer young people dealing with homelessness or home instability clearly have experience. That's what we look for. We're talking to people, we're getting their input, when we're hiring, they are experts, they have experience, and we need to see them as assets. And what I've been told directly from them is that staff and shelters need training. The training needs to be improved. It needs to recognize that young people that are accessing those services need to be at the table for planning and implementation. They need to be at the table for hiring and to get feedback about the programs, and feedback that actually comes with solutions that are effective, that are positive, that are safe. At Pathfinders, we really care about young people's feedback. It's hard, to hear feedback if it's not always positive, but that's okay. I think we want to do the best job that we can do. And I was a person that was hired by young people. All of our direct service staff and some of our administrative staff have also been hired with young people at the table. Giving feedback to the programs that are supposed to be servicing and helping them, and being at the table for planning and implementation, it sounds like 2 + 2 = 4 to me. And I think that it helps in the long run, because we want to end the problem. We don't want to keep putting a Band-Aid on it. And so if you're serving people, who best to hear from and learn from in order to improve your service to the community than the folks that you're serving directly? I'll get this mic right.
As far I don't know too much about this topic here, but the little things I do know is knowing what a person identify as far as like they, him, she, like all that type of stuff. We do like held that high in our organization because you can't offend a person by saying hey girl, hey boy, and that's not what they identify as. And it's like a kind of little trigger. So we do work with people, lots of our youth, on like proper pronouns and stuff like that, how to use them, how to ask a person what their pronouns and stuff is. So it's not like a big issue between like the youth and stuff and the staff. Me myself, I don't identify as, I mean, I'm everything. You call me anything in the book. I really don't care. But that is one of the things I do know about this culture thing and how it works.
Thank you. I know we're getting into the last few minutes. I want to get to some more audience questions for Justin, DeShanda, and Davonta. Someone is interested in what services are available to young people who are in their late teens and early 20s as they age out of other services, enter the workforce, etc. What more do we need to do for people of this age?
I feel like there needs to be more services as far as like getting rent assistance, because it's very hard. It was super hard trying to enroll in there. It was a lot of ups and downs. You get denied for simplest things like not having the right documents that you don't get enough time to do. So to get those things, they are very strict on like timing. So like being more lenient in timing would be a good thing. Having more like housing authority type organizations that help with those type of things would be nice, because one of the things that I had brought up an idea with the money that we did get was creating 4 houses for transitional living for the people within our age range. So like first 2 houses was 18 to 21, the other 2 was 22 to 26. And then like the plan was to get them like some type of assistance so they won't like naturally be out there on their own like right after that. So they won't necessarily be on the streets, like help, like when is it close to their time to age out of that, we would try and help with like getting rent assistance, getting you to a home, getting you stable income, like make sure you got the things that you need to be on your own.
I think that's totally reasonable. You're 18 years old, you're suddenly on your own, and you're expected to navigate a really intricate adult system that isn't set up to be helpful. So your points are really well made, Davonta. Thank you. DeShanda and Justin?
I always call this age group like the opportunity youth, because for a very long time resources weren't allocated to this group of people, and I think we have grown and learned that this is an area where we can really double down and make an impact. So I'm glad to see there have been programs. So I know one of the organizations here in Milwaukee was doing workforce development with that particular group, and I think that's important, especially for LGBTQ people to get at that age. We need more opportunities for mentorship and opportunities for shadowing so that this age group can start to look at some of the opportunities that are out there for them to pursue, to kind of find their niche and what they can do. Like Davonta just said, first off, I just want to kudos. I'm sitting on this panel with Davonta. I met him as a kid at James Madison Academic Campus years ago, and he was a thorn in my side. But to see he has transformed and become this amazing young man, this is a really, really big moment for me. So I'm really, again, kudos to you and proud to be next to you in this moment. But it was programs like what Davonta went through that has made it even possible for him to be here. So we need to double down on work like that, double down on giving them access, giving them opportunities to show their brilliance, be nurtured in an environment that will allow them to grow unabashedly, and be able to get the love and care from an adult that is a little wiser in the moment, right? Not saying that they aren't wise, because they do come with their own lived experience and wisdom, but how can we nurture that in a way that propels them forward into the life that we think that they want for themselves? So again, mentoring, job training, job shadowing is important for us to get through. Housing, I think, is an important thing that we need to do for this particular group. But I think a lot of that, again, is forthcoming. I think Milwaukee is ready and primed to do that type of work.
Yeah, the Youth Action Board, we were just talking about job readiness in the workforce, and there's a lot of assumptions from employers that youth don't want to work, that they're lazy, and really youth feel like the job force is just not ready for them, like they're not set up to teach and provide the skills. I mean, soft skills can be really hard when you're becoming a diverse organization and you're reaching people from different backgrounds, different identities, different experiences, and something that's something like coming to work on time, or using proper pronouns, or even just the way that you speak to people when you're a supervisor or a boss. And it can be very discouraging for young people that are trying to figure out what they need to eat from day to day, and it feels like you need to have your life all the way together to get an entry-level position. And so it makes it very difficult to find a career pathway or see yourself as a professional, or taking a career, or wanting to go to school or pick up something to make a valid income when it seems like doors are being closed in your face, or you're not being accepted because you're supposed to just be 100% perfect when you show up. And what we need to do is have more unrestricted and flexible funding like United Way, so that we can meet the financial needs of the people that we're serving and be able to prevent some of these things from happening. And something that we've been able to pilot is homeless prevention under our community case management program, and being able to provide financial assistance to young people so that if they do have some stable situation or some stability in their lives, let's keep that going. Let's help them to feel empowered and not discouraged because they're behind on a light bill, or because they're going to work and their child care fell through, or because the battery went out on their car. But the funder only allows for you to pay for food, or pay for this small percentage of something that is not really beneficial for the empowerment of that young person to really function from day to day and prevent them from losing their housing situation. And so that's something that we're strongly advocating for. Also being able to compensate youth directly for their time, for their experiences, for sharing their stories, for being a part of the implementation and planning of services, and giving us all of their expertise and knowledge, being able to compensate them appropriately, equitably, and just respecting the dignity of their experiences and their expertise.
Thank you all for sharing some really concrete ways that we can support this community. The last question, I know I'm over, it's just who I am, but I want to get to as many of your questions as I can. Darla and Tim, I'm curious, and so am I. They were, and I am. What trends look like for LGBTQ plus youth homelessness over time? As our country has become more accepting of LGBTQ plus people, are we seeing numbers of homeless youth decline, increase, or maintain?
Increase. Next question. No.
We're definitely not seeing. Okay, we're definitely not seeing a decline. I would say, we don't have any updated national data from 2017. One of the things we are advocating for is another federal investment in that study. Really, the federal government should be funding a national prevalence study of youth homelessness about every 3 years. Otherwise, how can we benchmark the progress that we're making as a nation in truly preventing and ending youth and young adult homelessness? It is included in the Runaway and Homeless Youth Trafficking Prevention Act that will be introduced this month, bipartisan and bicameral, so it is possible to work with both sides of the aisle on important legislation. It does also include a comprehensive non-discrimination clause. I would say the investment in solutions to homelessness has definitely plateaued and not kept up with cost of living and the actual cost of providing services. And yes, there's increased acceptance of the queer community, but not everywhere. And we've never seen the level of anti-trans and anti-queer legislation at the state level ever before. So, I think, with, marriage equality, then people thought, okay, we're good, right? But it's not. I mean, the queer community faces discrimination in employment and housing access in so many different areas of their life. And the mental load, is pretty exponential. I think what we're going to be seeing, similar to what Tim was saying about Pathfinders, at least what my hope is that every youth homelessness service provider across the country will be a welcoming and affirming space for all queer youth, for youth of color, and the outcomes and the metrics are going to be positive for queer and youth of color in terms of the exits and their life trajectory and their ability to achieve their hopes and dreams, access the education and employment that they want, and achieve upward socioeconomic mobility. I think that's what we're all here trying to work towards.
I would just add, anytime there is anti-queer legislation proposed, it is a license for some to feel safe and comfortable in discriminating. And so while on the one hand we can say, well, things are much better, in a lot of ways, they're really not. Our very first supported housing program that we launched as we focused on young adults or youth aging into adulthood 15 years ago next year is Q-Block. It's a program that we continue to have as part of a broader portfolio of supported housing resources for youth aging into adulthood. I will know that we have made legitimate and sustainable progress when we stop having funders or have the need to have these highly specialized programs available, and we simply offer supported housing for all young people. That'll say to me that we've made sustainable and institutional systems change. I think we're in some ways much better than we have been, but I know the same can't be said in other communities and in other countries, and certainly not in other states in this country. So we have a long way to go.
Thank you. Thank you to our amazing, passionate panelists. Thank you all for staying a little bit longer. Thank you for being here. Thank you for investing your time today. We all could talk about these issues for much longer, and would if we didn't turn microphones off. But if you're interested in having more conversations, I'm sure folks will stay around for a couple minutes. You can always reach out to our development team at Pathfinders at development@pathfindersmke.org. Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you.